Captain Lisa Morgan had been flying cargo ships for 7 years, and she thought she had seen everything the galaxy could throw at her, but today would prove her wrong in the worst possible way. The morning had started normal enough with her vessel, the Stardust Runner loaded with medical supplies bound for the mining colonies in the Outer Rim, and the flight plan was simple and boring, just the way she liked it. Lisa sat in the pilot's chair, drinking her third cup of coffee when the first alarm went off, and it was a small beep that meant nothing serious, just a minor fluctuation in the reactor coolant system. She checked the readouts and saw the temperature rising slowly in Engine Room 3 and frowned because the ship had just passed inspection 2 weeks ago and everything should have been running perfectly. Lisa stood up and headed toward the engine deck, and her boots echoed in the empty corridor because she was flying solo on this run to save money for the company, and that meant no crew and no backup if something went wrong. The temperature kept climbing as she walked, and by the time she reached the engine room door, the alarms were screaming and red lights flashed everywhere, and she knew this was bad. She punched the access code and the door slid open and a wall of heat hit her face, and she stumbled backward as black smoke poured into the corridor, and her eyes watered from the chemical stench. Lisa grabbed the fire extinguisher from the wall and rushed inside, but the flames were already spreading across the coolant lines, and she knew with sick certainty that the reactor was going to breach. She had maybe 5 minutes before the whole ship exploded, and her mind raced through options, and the escape pods were on the far side of the vessel near the cargo bay. Lisa turned and ran back through the smoke-filled corridor, and her lungs burned as she gasped for air, and she could hear metal groaning as the heat warped the hull. The ship shuddered violently, and she was thrown against the wall, and pain shot through her shoulder. But she kept moving because stopping meant dying. She reached the main corridor and headed for the escape pod bay when she heard something that made her blood run cold, and it was the sound of children crying. Lisa stopped dead in her tracks because that was impossible, and the manifest had clearly stated cargo, only no passengers, and especially no kids. But the crying was real, and getting louder, and she followed the sound to the passenger deck and kicked open the sealed door, and what she saw made her heart drop. There were 6 children huddled together in the corner of the smoke-filled room, and they were elven with pointed ears and silver hair, and their faces were streaked with tears and soot. The oldest looked about 12, and she held the youngest, who could not have been more than 4 years old, and the other 4 clung to each other in terror. Lisa did not waste time asking how they got there or why they were hidden on her ship, and she just ran to them and knelt down and said in a calm voice that everything would be okay, even though she knew it probably would not be. The oldest girl looked at her with eyes full of fear and said something in a language Lisa did not understand, but the meaning was clear, and they were begging for help. Lisa pointed to herself and then to the door and made running motions, and the children seemed to understand, because they stood up on shaky legs. She picked up the 2 smallest ones and tucked them under her arms like footballs and told the others to grab onto her belt and jacket, and they did without hesitation. The ship rocked again, and the floor tilted at a crazy angle, and they all stumbled, but Lisa kept her balance and pushed forward through the smoke. Her eyes burned and she could barely see, and the heat was unbearable. But she kept moving, and the children stayed with her, and their small hands gripped her clothes desperately. They reached the main corridor, and Lisa could see the escape pod bay ahead, but another explosion somewhere deep in the ship sent them all sprawling to the floor. The youngest child screamed, and Lisa scooped her up again and shouted for the others to keep moving, and they scrambled to their feet and ran. The escape pod bay door was just 20 feet away when Lisa noticed the problem, and the door was jammed shut, and the control panel was sparking and damaged from the heat. She set the children down and pulled at the door with all her strength, and her fingers bled as she clawed at the metal edges, but it would not budge. The children watched her with terrified eyes, and the oldest girl tried to help, but she was too small and too weak, and Lisa knew they were running out of time. She could feel the heat building behind them and smell the burning plastic and hear the reactor reaching critical levels, and they had maybe 1 minute left. Lisa braced her feet against the wall and pulled with everything she had, and her muscles screamed in protest and sweat poured down her face, and then finally the door groaned and moved an inch. She pulled again, and the door slid open enough for them to squeeze through, and she shoved the children inside one by one, and they tumbled into the escape pod. Lisa climbed in after them and sealed the door and ran to the control panel, and her hands shook as she punched in the launch sequence. The screen lit up with calculations, and her heart sank when she saw the problem in the escape. Pod was designed for 6 passengers maximum, but there were 7 of them. The computer flashed red and displayed a message that said insufficient power for current passenger load and manual override required. Lisa looked at the children and they stared back at her with hope in their eyes, and she knew what she had to do. The oldest girl seemed to understand, and she stood up and tried to move toward the door, but Lisa gently pushed her back down and shook her head. She smiled at the children and hoped they would remember that someone cared enough to save them, and then she hit the emergency override and the pod shot away from the ship. Through the small window, Lisa watched the escape pod streak towards safety, and then the reactor exploded, and the shockwave hit her like a hammer. She felt herself flying backward through space, and the cold was instant and absolute, and her lungs screamed for air that was not there. The last thing Lisa saw before darkness took her was the stars spinning above, and she thought that at least the children would live, and that had to be enough. Everything went black and silent, and she felt her body shutting down and knew she was dying. But there was no fear, only a strange sense of peace. Then something changed, and there was warmth where there should have been cold and light where there should have been darkness. Lisa opened her eyes and found herself lying on soft grass under a sky that was the wrong color, and she tried to sit up, but pain stopped. Her standing over her was a woman with silver hair and pointed ears and glowing eyes, and beside the woman were 2 massive creatures that could only be dragons. The woman spoke in that same musical language the children had used, and somehow Lisa understood the words, and they were, "You saved my daughter." Lisa blinked and tried to make sense of what she was seeing, because the last thing she remembered was floating in space and dying. And now she was on solid ground under a purple sky with 2 dragons staring at her. The woman with silver hair knelt beside her and placed a gentle hand on Lisa's chest, and warmth spread through her body. But the pain was still there, sharp and terrible. The woman spoke again, and this time Lisa heard the words clearly in her own language, and she said, "You are badly hurt human and your body is failing, but you live because my magic holds you here." Lisa tried to speak, but her throat was raw and her lips were cracked, and all she managed was a weak croak. The woman lifted Lisa's head and held a flask to her lips, and cool water flowed into her mouth, and it tasted like nothing she had ever experienced before, sweet and clean and full of life. After a few sips, Lisa found her voice and whispered, "Where am I and what happened to the children?" The woman smiled, and it was like the sun breaking through clouds, and she said, "You are in the Sylvan realm far from your human space, and the children are safe because of you." She continued and said, "I am Queen Ariana, and those children you saved were returning from a diplomatic mission when their transport was destroyed and they hid on your vessel." Hoping to reach safety, Lisa closed her eyes and felt relief wash over her because the children were alive, and that was all that mattered. But then the pain came back stronger than before, and she gasped, and Queen Ariana's face grew serious, and she said, "You are dying human, and your injuries are too severe for even my magic to heal completely." Lisa had suspected as much because she could feel her body shutting down, and her breathing was shallow and her heart beat irregularly, and she knew she did not have much time left. She looked at the Queen and said, "Then I am glad I got to see that the children made it, and I have no regrets." Ariana studied her for a long moment, and something like respect showed in her glowing eyes, and she said, "You gave your life for strangers without hesitation, and that is a rare thing, even among my people." One of the dragons moved closer, and Lisa got her first real look at the creature, and it was magnificent with scales that shimmered red and gold like living fire, and eyes that held ancient wisdom. The other dragon was larger, with scales of deep blue and silver, and both creatures radiated power that made the air feel heavy and charged. Queen Ariana turned to the dragons and spoke in that musical language, and they responded with deep rumbling sounds that Lisa felt in her chest. The Queen looked back at Lisa and said, "I have discussed your situation with my bonded companions, and we have reached a decision." She paused and then said, "In my culture there is a sacred bond between dragon and rider, and it is the highest honor that can be bestowed, and it is given only to those who prove themselves worthy, through extraordinary acts of courage and selflessness." Lisa listened but did not understand why the Queen was telling her this when she was about to die. Ariana continued, and said the bond does more than connect dragon and rider, and it shares life, force and strength, and when a dragon bonds with someone, their magic heals and transforms and makes the rider stronger and longer lived. The smaller dragon with red and gold scales moved even closer and lowered her massive head until she was looking directly into Lisa's eyes. The queen said, "This is Ember, and she has chosen you." Lisa stared at the dragon and felt something pass between them, and it was like recognition or understanding. And Ember's eyes seemed to look into her soul. "Queen Ariana," said Ember, "wishes to bond with you if you accept, and the bond will save your life and heal your wounds, and you will become something more than human." She added and said, "But you must understand that this bond cannot be broken, and once formed, you and Ember will be connected until death, and her life will be your life, and your life will be hers." Lisa looked at the magnificent creature before her and thought about everything she had lost, and her ship was gone, and her old life was over, and she was supposed to be dead. But here was a chance to live, and not just live, but to have something she had never dreamed possible. She met Ember's eyes and whispered, "Yes, I accept." Ember released a sound that was half roar and half song, and the dragon's joy was so powerful that Lisa felt tears stream down her face. Queen Ariana placed both hands on Lisa's shoulders and began to chant in that ancient language, and the other dragon storm moved to stand beside Ember. Ember lowered her head until her snout touched Lisa's chest, and suddenly, golden light poured from the dragon and surrounded Lisa like a cocoon. The light was warm and bright, and it filled every part of her body, and Lisa felt her broken bones knitting back together, and her burned skin healing, and her damaged organs repairing themselves. But more than that, she felt something fundamental changing inside her, and it was like a door opening in her mind. And suddenly she could sense Ember's thoughts and emotions and memories. She saw through Ember's eyes and felt the dragon's heartbeat sync with her own, and understood the weight of centuries of life and wisdom that the dragon carried. The bond went both ways, and Lisa felt Ember exploring her mind and seeing her memories, and understanding who she was and what she valued. Ember saw Lisa's loneliness and her determination and her fierce need to protect others, even at cost to herself, and the dragon approved. The light grew brighter and brighter until Lisa could not see anything else, and then suddenly it was gone and she was lying on the grass again. But everything was different now, and Lisa sat up without pain and looked at her hands, and they were unmarked and healed, and she felt stronger than she ever had. Before Queen Ariana smiled and said, "Welcome, Sister Rider, and you are now bonded to Ember, and you are one of us." Lisa stood, and her legs felt steady and strong, and Ember moved to her side, and Lisa reached out and touched the dragon's scales and felt the warmth and life flowing beneath them. Through the bond, she felt Ember's happiness and pride and fierce protective love, and Lisa knew that she was no longer alone. The queen said, "You saved 6 lives today, human, and one of them was my youngest daughter, and for that you have earned not just the dragon bond but the eternal gratitude of the Sylvan realm." Lisa looked at Ariana and asked, "What happens now?" The queen laughed, and it was a beautiful sound like bells ringing, and she said, "Now you learn to fly, because having a dragon is one thing, but riding one is something else entirely." Storm. The larger dragon snorted, and smoke curled from his nostrils, and Ariana patted his neck affectionately and said, "My companion thinks you will be a natural, but we shall see." Lisa looked at Ember and felt the dragon's eagerness through their bond, and despite everything she had been through, she smiled. She had lost her ship and her old life, but she had gained something far more valuable, and she had a purpose and a partner and a new family. The first week in the Sylvan realm passed like a dream for Lisa, and she spent her days learning about her new home and getting to know Ember through their bond queen. Ariana had given her quarters in the palace, and the room was beautiful, with walls made of living wood and windows that looked out over endless forests and crystal-clear lakes. But Lisa spent most of her time outside with Ember, and the dragon never strayed far from her side, and through their connection, Lisa learned that this was normal for newly bonded pairs. They needed time to adjust to each other and to build trust and understanding. And the bond was still new and fragile, like a seedling that needed careful tending. Ember taught Lisa how to communicate without words, and it started with simple things like yes and no. And come and stay, Lisa would think a thought and push it through the bond, and Ember would respond, and gradually they developed their own language that was faster and clearer than speaking on. The third day, Queen Ariana brought the 6 children to meet Lisa, and they ran to her with tears and laughter and hugged her tightly. The youngest one, whose name was Kira, would not let go of Lisa's hand and kept saying, "Thank you, in her small voice. The oldest girl, who was called Nira, said, "You died for us and we thought we would never get to thank you." Lisa knelt down so she was at eye level with them and said, "I would do it again without hesitation, and I am just glad you are all safe." Kira looked at Ember with wide eyes full of wonder and asked, "Can I touch your dragon?" Ember lowered her head and made a soft rumbling sound, and Lisa felt through the bond that the dragon was inviting the child closer. Kira reached out with one small hand and touched Ember's scales and gasped at how warm they were, and the other children came forward too, and Ember let them all pet her gently. Queen Ariana watched with a smile and said, "Ember is gentle with younglings, and that is a good sign because it means she trusts you completely." After the children left, Ariana said, "It is time for you to begin your training, and tomorrow we will teach you to fly." Lisa felt a mix of excitement and terror because flying on a dragon was something she had never imagined doing, and despite her years piloting ships, this was completely different. That night she could not sleep, and she lay in bed thinking about all the ways things could go wrong, and what if she fell off, or what if she could not control Ember, or what if she froze with fear through the bond. Ember sent waves of calm and confidence, and Lisa felt the dragon's absolute certainty that they would succeed together. The next morning, Lisa met Ariana and Storm at the training grounds, and it was a wide-open field on the edge of a cliff overlooking a vast valley. Ariana was already mounted on Storm, and she made it look easy and natural, like she had been born in the saddle. The queen explained that riding required trust above all, else the dragon did most of the work and the rider just had to stay balanced and communicate their intentions. Through the bond, Lisa approached Ember, and the dragon crouched low to make it easier to climb up, and Lisa grabbed onto the ridges of Ember's neck and pulled herself onto the dragon's back. There was no saddle because Ariana said that true bonded riders did not need them, and they used their connection and their sense of balance to stay mounted. Lisa settled herself just behind Ember's shoulders where the neck met the body, and she could feel the powerful muscles moving beneath the scales. Ember stood, and Lisa grabbed tighter, and her heart pounded because she was suddenly very high off the ground. Ariana called out instructions and said, "Grip with your legs and lean into the turns, and most importantly, trust your dragon to keep you safe." Storm launched into the air with a massive leap, and his wings spread wide and caught the wind, and he rose into the sky with powerful strokes. Lisa watched them go and felt Ember's eagerness through the bond, and the dragon was practically vibrating with the desire to follow. She took a deep breath and thought the word "ready" through their connection. Ember did not hesitate, and she leaped forward, and her wings snapped open, and suddenly they were airborne. Lisa's stomach dropped, and she pressed herself flat against Ember's neck and closed her eyes because the ground was falling away at a terrifying speed. But through the bond, she felt Ember's joy and confidence, and slowly Lisa opened her eyes and looked around. They were flying, and the wind rushed past her face, and the world spread out below them in shades of green and blue and gold. Ember banked to the left, and Lisa leaned with the turn, just like Ariana had instructed, and they swooped over the forest, and Lisa laughed because it was the most incredible feeling she had ever experienced. Storm flew alongside them, and Ariana called out encouragement and said, "You are a natural, just as my companion predicted." They flew for an hour, and Lisa gradually relaxed and began to enjoy the sensation, and she experimented with different positions and found the most comfortable way to sit. Ember responded to her thoughts almost before Lisa finished thinking them, and when she wanted to go higher, Ember climbed, and when she wanted to see the lake below. Ember descended. Landing was harder than taking off, and Ember had to slow down carefully and angle her wings just right, and Lisa held on tight as they touched down with a slight bump. She slid off the dragon's back, and her legs were shaky, and her hands were cramping from gripping so hard. But she was grinning like a fool. Ariana landed beside them and said, "Well done, and tomorrow we will work on advanced maneuvers and combat flying." Lisa's smile faded, and she asked, "Combat flying?" The queen's expression grew serious, and she said yes, because the bond is not just a gift, and it comes with responsibilities, and dragon riders are protectors and warriors, and you will need to defend the realm. Over the following weeks, Lisa trained hard, and she learned how to make Ember dive and roll and spiral through the air and how to hang on during violent maneuvers. She learned to fight, from dragonback using a lance and bow, and her human reflexes combined with Ember's speed made her surprisingly effective. Ariana taught her about the threats that faced the Sylvan realm, and there were raiders from the wasteland and rogue mages, and occasionally monsters that came down from the northern mountains. Lisa also studied the language and culture of the elven people, and she wanted to understand her new home and her new family. The 6 children visited her often, and especially Kira, who seemed to have adopted Lisa as a second mother. Kira would sit and watch Lisa train and ask endless questions about humans and space, and what it was like to fly among the stars. Lisa told her stories about her old life and the places she had seen and the things she had done, and Kira listened with rapt attention. One day Kira said, "When I grow up, I want to be just like you and ride a dragon and save people." Lisa ruffled her hair and said, "You can be anything you want to be, and I believe in you." Queen Ariana overheard and smiled and said, "Perhaps one day another dragon will choose you, young one, and then you and Lisa will fly together as sisters." That night, as Lisa lay in bed with Ember sleeping nearby, she thought about how much her life had changed. She had gone from a lonely cargo pilot with no family and no future to a dragon rider with purpose and belonging and people who cared about her. Through the bond, she felt Ember's contentment and love, and Lisa knew that she had finally found where she was meant to be. 3 months had passed since Lisa bonded with Ember, and she had become confident in the air, and her bond with the dragon was now as natural as breathing. She woke each morning before dawn and flew patrol routes with Ember over the northern borders of the Sylvan realm where threats were most common. Queen Ariana said Lisa was ready for her first real mission, and not just training exercises but actual protection duty for one of the outer villages. The village was called Silverbrook, and it sat at the base of the mountains where traders came to exchange goods with the elven people. And lately, there had been reports of raiders attacking travelers on the road. Lisa felt nervous as she and Ember flew toward Silverbrook with Storm and Ariana beside them, and this was her chance to prove she was worthy of the bond and the trust that had been placed in her. The village appeared below them, and it was small, with maybe 50 buildings clustered around a clear stream and fields of crops stretched out in neat rows. They landed in the village square, and the elven people came out to greet them, and they bowed to Queen Ariana and stared at Lisa with curiosity. An older elf with gray hair approached and said, "I am Elder Vincent, and we are grateful. You have come because the raiders grow bolder each day." Ariana asked about the attacks, and Vincent explained that a group of bandits had set up camp in the mountain pass, and they stopped every caravan and took supplies and sometimes took people. Lisa listened carefully and asked how many raiders and what weapons did they carry. Vincent said there were at least 20 of them, and they had crude swords and bows, and one of them seemed to have magic because he could throw fire. Ariana frowned and said, "A rogue mage, and that is concerning because they are unpredictable and dangerous." She turned to Lisa and said, "We will scout the pass tomorrow at dawn and locate their camp, and then decide how to handle them." That night, Lisa could not sleep, and she lay on the bedroll the villagers had provided and stared at the ceiling and thought about the coming fight. She had trained for combat, but had never actually faced a real enemy. And what if she failed? And what if someone got hurt? Because of her mistakes, Ember sent reassurance through the bond and images of them flying together strong and united, and Lisa felt her fear ease a little. Before dawn, they took to the air and flew toward the mountain pass, and the sun was just starting to rise and painted the sky in shades of pink and orange. The pass was narrow with steep cliffs on both sides, and it was the only route through the mountains for miles, and that made it perfect for an ambush. Lisa spotted the raider camp first, and she sent the location to Ember, who relayed it to Storm, and they circled high above where they could observe without being seen. There were indeed about 20 raiders, and they had rough tents and a cooking fire and weapons scattered around, and they looked confident and relaxed like they owned the place. Lisa saw the mage that Vincent had mentioned, and he sat apart from the others and wore dark robes, and his hands glowed faintly with magical energy. Ariana studied the camp and said, "We cannot attack directly, because the mage will use his fire and could hurt innocent travelers if any are passing through." She continued and said, "We need to draw them out and split them up, and then deal with them in smaller groups." Lisa suggested using herself, as bait, and she could fly low and make them think she was alone. And when they chased her, Ariana could attack from behind. The queen considered this and said, "It is risky, but it could work. And are you certain you are ready?" Lisa nodded and said, I'm ready, and Ember agrees. They descended, and Lisa flew Ember into the pass at low altitude and made sure the raiders could see them clearly. The bandits shouted in alarm and grabbed their weapons, and the mage stood and raised his hands, and fire gathered in his palms. Lisa urged Ember to fly faster, and they raced through the pass with the raiders giving chase on foot, and some of them had horses, and they mounted quickly. The mage threw a fireball, and it streaked toward them, but Ember rolled to the side, and the flames missed by inches, and Lisa felt the heat on her face. She led them away from the camp and deeper into the pass, where the cliffs narrowed even more, and then she gave the signal through the bond. Ember climbed steeply, and Lisa held on tight as they rose above the cliff walls, and Ariana and Storm appeared from behind the rocks where they had been hiding. Storm dove at the raiders with a roar that shook the ground, and the bandits scattered in panic, and Ariana used her magic to create vines that wrapped around their legs and held them in place. The mage was still free, and he launched more fireballs at Storm, but the dragon was too fast and avoided them easily. Lisa saw her chance, and she urged Ember to dive, and they fell like a stone toward the mage, and at the last second Ember pulled up and raked her claws across his raised hands. The mage screamed and dropped his spell, and Lisa swung her lance and caught him in the shoulder, and he fell to the ground, unconscious. The remaining raiders surrendered quickly when they saw their leader defeated, and Ariana used her magic to bind them with unbreakable cords of light. They marched the prisoners back to Silverbrook, and Elder Vincent was overjoyed and said, "The pass will be safe again, thanks to you." Lisa felt proud but also relieved that no one had been seriously hurt, and she had passed her first real test. That evening, the village held a celebration, and they roasted meat and played music, and the children danced around the fire. Kira had come with a group from the capital, and she ran to Lisa and hugged her and said, "I knew you could do it." Lisa laughed and said it was a team effort, and I could not have done it without Ember and Queen Ariana, but Kira shook her head and said, "You were brave and you led the charge, and everyone is talking about the human dragon rider who defeated the raiders." Over the next few months, Lisa went on more missions, and each one taught her something new, and she rescued travelers and stopped thieves, and once even helped fight off a massive bear that was threatening a logging camp. Her reputation grew, and people throughout the realm began to call her the Human Rider, and they told stories about her courage, and her bond with Ember. Lisa still thought of her old life sometimes, and wondered what had happened to her ship, and whether anyone from human space was looking for her. But those thoughts came less and less frequently, because she had found something here that she had never had before, and she had purpose and family and a true partner in Ember. One night, she sat on a cliff overlooking the valley with Ember beside her, and the stars spread out above them in familiar patterns. She said to Ember through their bond, "Do you ever regret choosing me and giving up your freedom?" Ember's response was immediate and filled with warmth, and it was not words but feelings and images, and the meaning was clear. The dragon had not given up freedom, but gained it, because flying together was better than flying alone, and their bond made them both stronger. Lisa smiled and leaned against Ember's warm side and said, "I feel the same way, and I would not trade this for anything." Through the bond, Ember sent contentment and love, and they sat together in comfortable silence and watched the moons rise over the Sylvan Realm. A year had passed since Lisa arrived in the Sylvan Realm, and she had become one of the most respected dragon riders in the kingdom, and people sought her help and protection without hesitation. She was returning from a routine patrol when Ember suddenly tensed beneath her and sent urgent alarm through their bond. Lisa immediately scanned the sky and ground and asked, "What is wrong?" Ember sent images of darkness and cold and ancient evil waking, and Lisa felt a chill run down her spine because the dragon was genuinely afraid, and that was something she had never felt before. They flew faster toward the capital, and when they arrived, Queen Ariana was already in the courtyard with Storm, and her face was grave. The queen said, "Something terrible has happened, and the seal on the northern waste has been broken, and the creature we imprisoned there 1,000 years ago is free." Lisa asked what creature, and Ariana's expression grew darker. She said, "His name is Malakar, and he is a dragon gone. mad with power and corruption, and he tried to conquer our realm centuries ago. And we barely defeated him then by trapping him in a magical prison. The queen continued and said now he is free and filled with rage, and he will come for revenge, and we must stop him before he destroys everything. Lisa felt fear grip her heart because she had faced raiders and thieves and wild animals. But this was something else entirely. And this was a dragon corrupted and evil and far more powerful than anything. She had encountered. Ariana gathered all the dragon riders in the realm, and there were only 12 of them, including Lisa, and they met in the Great Hall to plan their defense. An older rider named Henrik said we should flee and take the people to safety, and we cannot fight Malachar because he is too strong. But Ariana shook her head and said, if we flee he will hunt us down, and there is nowhere in this world we can hide from him, and we must make our stand. Here Lisa listened to the debate, and finally spoke up and said, what if we do not try to kill him but trap him again? The other riders looked at her, and Henrik said, the spell that trapped him took 50 mages working together, and most of them died from the effort, and we do not have that kind of power now. Lisa thought for a moment and said, what if we do not need to trap him permanently but just long enough to weaken him, and then we can finish him? Queen Ariana studied her and said, explain your thinking. Lisa said, we lure him into a narrow canyon where his size works against him, and then we use magic to collapse the walls and bury him temporarily. And while he is trapped, we attack with everything we have. It was risky and dangerous, but it was better than trying to face him in open combat where his power and size would be overwhelming. Ariana consulted with her advisors and the other riders, and finally agreed to Lisa's plan. They spent 2 days preparing, and Lisa worked with Ember to practice the precise flying they would need, and the margin for error would be. Tiny Kira came to see Lisa before the battle, and the young elf had tears in her eyes, and she said, please come back, and I cannot lose you. Lisa hugged her tight and said, I will do everything I can to return, and you have my promise. The next morning they flew north toward the wastes, and the sky grew darker as they approached, and the air felt wrong and poisoned. They saw Malachar from miles away, and he was enormous, at least 3 times the size of Storm, and his scales were black as night and seemed to absorb light. His eyes glowed red with hatred and madness, and when he roared, the sound was like mountains breaking. The dragon riders spread out according to the plan, and Lisa and Ember took the lead position because they would be the bait. She flew straight at Malachar and shouted insults and challenges and tried to anger him enough to give chase. Malachar's eyes focused on her, and he roared again and launched himself forward with terrifying speed. Lisa urged Ember to fly faster, and they raced toward the canyon they had chosen, and it was narrow with high walls and a dead end. Behind them, Malachar followed, and his massive wings churned the air, and he was gaining on them. They reached the canyon and flew inside, and Lisa could feel the walls pressing close on both sides, and Ember had to fold her wings partially to fit. Malachar entered the canyon behind them, and his size made it even tighter for him, and he scraped against the rocks as he pursued them. This was the moment they had planned for, and Lisa sent the signal through Ember to the other riders. Queen Ariana and the mages on the ground unleashed their spell, and the canyon walls began to shake and crack, and huge boulders fell from above. Malachar roared in fury as the rocks trapped his wings and buried his legs, and he struggled to break free. But more and more stone kept falling. Lisa and Ember reached the end of the canyon and shot straight up and escaped, just as the entire passage collapsed. But Malachar was not finished and even buried under tons of rock. He breathed black fire that melted stone, and he began to dig his way out. The other riders attacked while he was weakened, and they struck with lances and arrows and magic, and Ember joined them and raked her claws across Malachar's exposed neck. The corrupted dragon fought back with savage fury, and he caught one rider with his tail and sent them crashing to the ground, and Lisa saw with horror that it was Henrik and he was not moving. Rage filled her, and she dove at Malachar again, and this time she aimed for his eyes, and she thrust her lance with all her strength. The weapon pierced his left eye, and Malachar screamed in pain and thrashed wildly, and nearly caught Ember with his claws. Queen Ariana called out the final spell, and she and Storm combined their magic into a spear of pure light, and they drove it into Malachar's chest. The corrupted dragon staggered, and his roar became a whimper, and the red glow faded from his remaining eye. He looked at them with something that might have been understanding or regret, and then he collapsed, and his massive body shook. The earth silence fell over the battlefield, and the riders landed cautiously and checked to make sure he was truly dead. Lisa went to Henrik and found that he was badly hurt, but still alive, and the healers rushed to help him. Queen Ariana approached Malakar's body and placed a hand on his scales and said he was once a great and noble dragon, but pride and power corrupted him, and this is what he became. She looked at Lisa and said, "You showed great courage today, and your plan saved many lives, and you have proven yourself beyond any doubt." Lisa felt exhausted and sad because, even though they had won, the cost was high, and several riders were injured, and Henrik might never fly again. That night they held a ceremony for those who had fallen and those who had fought bravely, and Lisa stood with the other riders and felt the weight of what they had accomplished. Kira ran to her when she returned to the capital and hugged her tight and said, "I knew you would come back." Lisa held her and said, "I promised, and I always keep my promises." In the months that followed, life slowly returned to normal, and Henrik recovered enough to walk, but he could no longer ride, and he became a teacher for young riders. Instead, Lisa continued her patrols and missions, and her bond with Ember grew even stronger, and they moved as one, and thought as one. One day she stood on the cliff where she often went to think and watch the sunset, and Ember was beside her as always. She thought about the day her ship exploded, and how she had been ready to die, and now here she was alive and bonded to a magnificent dragon and part of a family. Ariana approached and stood beside her and said, "You have found your place here, human, and I am grateful that fate brought you to us." Lisa smiled and said, "I am grateful too, and I would not change anything even if I could." The queen said, "The children you saved that day are growing up strong, and Kira tells everyone she knows that she wants to be just like you." Lisa laughed and said, "That girl is going to be trouble one day." Ariana nodded and said, "Yes, but the good kind of trouble, and perhaps one day a dragon will choose her and she will fly beside you." They stood together and watched the sun set over the Sylvan realm, and Lisa felt at peace. She had lost everything and been given a second chance, and she had made the most of it and found purpose and belonging and love. Through the bond, Ember sent contentment and joy and images of them flying together forever. And Lisa sent the same feelings back. She was home, and she was exactly where she belonged.